Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to introduce to you Jesse Dean and Nate Regola. Jesse Dean is a CISSP and a PMP. He holds a master's in information technology from the George Washington University. His career in cybersecurity has transitioned from supporting a federal law enforcement agency to consulting for dozens of U.S. defense and civilian agencies in the areas of cybersecurity, policy, audit, and compliance, to leading large IT infrastructure projects in healthcare, to include an AWS cloud, winning his program the Federal Health IT Innovation Award, and currently he is the Senior Director of TDI's Solution Division. To his left, my right, is Nathan Regola. He is a PhD and a JD, wow, lawyer and a doctor, nice. Has formal training in computer science and information technology law. His interest in cloud security has been strengthened by work on large-scale data mining systems, serving as the lead architect on one of the largest public cloud deployments in the civilian sector, contributing to the architecture of one of the largest OpenStack private cloud deployments in the US, and holding a variety of consulting and data science roles for Fortune 500 companies. Please give them a warm welcome to the event today.
Great, thank you, John. Can everyone hear me? Yes, in the back? Good. All right, so Nate and I are very excited to be here today. After lunch, I know, hopefully not too many sleepy eyes out there. Everyone looks pretty alert and awake. I'll try to make this as exciting as possible in terms of, I don't know, it's security metrics, right? So we'll do what we can. So here's what we see, right? You've all been in the business probably just as long, if not longer, than I have. Maybe not all of you, some young faces out there. But we see a lot of blind spots, right? This is what we see, this is what we report up to leadership, a lot of blind spots, right? I mean, this could be you have a compliance program, you have a SOC, and yet we still don't see the complete picture. The reality is we have a fire coming in the woods across the street, right? So we either don't see it or we fail to report this to leadership. And there could be a number of reasons why we do this. One, we're understaffed, right? We don't have all the people we need. We have things going on that require our attention, and we just can't get the reports that we need and the right information we need, right? So this is the spreadsheets that get passed around from organization to organization, and we lose accountability, traceability, and visibility into what really matters. Does this sound familiar to anyone? There's a lot going on, right? We're doing all that we can, trying to provide the reports to leadership. And when I say leadership too, it's CISO up to provost to CIO, up to the board of directors even, right? What information do they need, and are they really seeing what's going on? Because the title of the presentation contains some acronyms, I just want to make sure that we all understand what those acronyms mean. When I say GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance, does everyone loosely understand what that is? There's some tools that support that. Quick show of hands. Yes, good, very good. And then SIM tools, Splunk, Rapid7, everyone knows what that is, I'm pretty sure. So if we look at where we are, right, in most organizations, especially when compliance is a concern, you have a NIST 853 or 171 now in some cases in the university space. We have that attestation that, hey, we're doing these certain things, right? Whether that's we're scanning with a certain tool, we have Nessus, or we have Qualys, or we have Splunk capturing logs, and we retain those Splunk logs for 2 years. And that gets reported up to leadership, and the auditors come in, and it's a nice warm and fuzzy, right? It's low risk. We have a tool. We're supposed to be doing these things. We have the policy, we have the people. So thumbs up, everyone's happy. And then we transition to the operational side of things. Most of us probably have a SOC, maybe we outsource a SOC, but we're taking and we're operationalizing what we're asserting there in policy. Everyone's busy, right? We got many, many hundreds or thousands of logs, events that come in every day. 2 FTEs, 3 FTEs, whatever the size of your SOC is. Things are happening, right? Lots of activity. So between the two of those things, I feel kind of good, right? Some of you are like, yeah, I don't know. I know how it really is. That's great. It's a good picture. But I know that's not quite the case. And that's where we come in today. We're going to be talking about CPI. So fairly new term, probably should have spelled it out there. But cybersecurity performance improvement. So it's really filling the gap between the two and bridging the gap from that first view where we had all these gaps and the picture wasn't quite clear. Now what we're able to do, and we'll be talking more about this later today, maybe the picture isn't so great. Maybe we're only capturing 90% of our application logs or our OS logs in Splunk. And maybe that's on our PCI network, or that's on a network that manages healthcare if there's a hospital associated with the university. But that's the crown jewels, if you will, right? We want to understand what those assets are, and we want to protect them. So how are we doing against that, essentially an SLA, right, a service level agreement, where you bought Splunk, right, because you have a PCI network or there's some requirement that you want to manage your logs and investigate and do all of the things, but yet how are you doing as an organization and actually capturing 100% of all of those operating systems that you care about? So it's been our experience, both Nate and I, and Nate will come up here in a few minutes. Large organizations, small organizations, it's been very difficult to track that information from our security teams. I used to be part of a security team. I've managed security teams, and like I said in the beginning, people are running around in 12 different directions. I say, hey, are we capturing all the logs, yes or no? Well, let me go get the spreadsheet, right? I'll get back to you in a couple of days. Best intention, right? Sometimes it's, like I said, it's easier to lose the traceability and accountability. So if we're able to capture that information, say in real time through automation, how neat would that be, right? So you have a dashboard where everyone can see what's going on, from the SOC analyst to the SOC manager, all the way up to the CISO. We know that our organizational goal is, I need to capture 100% of those PCI logs. Am I doing it? Well, I can tell right now that I am, because I'm comparing my known inventory for that network against my log data, and it shows me exactly where my gaps are. And if I'm not, then I can quickly see, well, I may need to dig into a certain area, because I either have a process issue, or maybe it's a training issue, or maybe the tool is just not quite where it needs to be yet. So it really brings those issues to light that we probably all kind of know in the back of our head, but how do you take it to the next level? Any questions about the setup here with GRC and SIM and what we're looking at today? Yes?
Does CPI take into account how important this logs are versus the other logs that you have?
Right. So the idea would be that you would understand what your business critical applications are, and those would be more important. So you have a public, web-facing type application, probably more important than something that's, in the back office that's not public-facing. Right. Anyone else? No? Okay. So I'll bring Nate up here real quick, and this is a conversation that I've heard at least on one occasion, a quick role play where I'll play the role of the CISO, and Nate will play the role of the Splunk manager, okay? So again, something we've heard, maybe you've heard it too, I hope so. Hopefully not, actually, but I think it's more common than we all hope to admit here. So Nate, so you know that we've spent, I think, $200,000 on Splunk last year, and I'm curious, how are we progressing on the enterprise security aspect of Splunk? How is that rollout looking?
The team installed it a few days ago, and they've enabled a few types of alerts. So we have about 4 alerts enabled.
Okay. Are we collecting all the PCI asset data? Are we scanning against? No?
The team's trying to correlate the vulnerability scanner results with the inventory and the Splunk results, and they're working through some spreadsheets and trying to write some scripts.
Okay. Well, when can I get a report on the status then?
It might take a week to get a number I'm confident in to pass along to you.
A week, okay. Why don't we go ahead and do that then, if that's the best you can do. In the meantime, right, what you're investigating an incident, right? And I know you have a lot on your plate right now.
And there's some custom work trying to help application teams build some alerts operationally, so we're trying to help them use Splunk,
Right,
and so that's taking some time.
right. Well, I guess do the best you can. Thank you, Nate, for that. And you can see, I don't know, I get frustrated when I hear that. I mean, I get it and I relate. It's a fine line that we walk as security leaders. Having seen both sides of it, we know that the team's doing the best they can, but yet it's frustrating not to get the data, say, instantaneously and the information that we need to make a decision. So I know, as a CISO, where we are at any given point in time from a security perspective, right? We'll talk about risk a little bit and how this plays into it. But just because I have Splunk and just because I have a Splunk team doesn't necessarily mean that I'm secure. I think this is kind of common sense type stuff here, but I think a lot of people get lulled into a false sense of security. I'm compliant and I have a tool, I spent a lot of money. What's the message to the board of directors? What's the message to the provost? What type of data is being reported to show how effective is my team, right? Not how active am I, what am I doing? John Wooten, famous basketball coach, said, don't mistake activity for achievement. And I think that is true in a lot of cases. But in the security world, I think we need to do a better job of aligning the team and being on the same page for what the goals are, what the objectives are, and those key results are across the team, so everyone's in lockstep moving forward. So again, we'll be talking a lot about metrics today, and then I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So what we're not talking about here is, hey, I've got 700 vulnerabilities on my network. That's great, but you know, I guess that's a start. That's not really what this is about here. What we want to do is take that to the next level, and you think of an evolution. So you have an immature security program you're just starting, and again, it's fairly common, actually. You want to take that to the next level and compare inventory against your scan data, against your log data, against your firewall data, like the prior talk from Columbia. Taking that information and really making sense of it so you can take action, right? Making sure that data has context and is actionable. So what it is, right? So how many critical vulnerabilities on all known PCI assets for over 7 days, or if it's 14 days, whatever your SLA, your service level agreement is, whatever you decided as an organization that you need to adhere to. How are you performing against that? Maybe you don't know. Should it be 7 days? Maybe it should be 14 days. Well, that's a great conversation, right? What are your overarching objectives? Who's your audience? Talk to the CISO, right? Hopefully the CISO, maybe from the provost on down, is providing information like, hey Splunk team, hey vulnerability team, these are the types of things I need to be seeing in my reports. If they are, fantastic. If not, have the conversation with them. Say, hey boss, you know, I don't know that these are entirely helpful. The number of vulnerabilities, it's great. It's showing that we're doing some things, and that's fantastic. We're busy. We work long hours. But what about this, right? What about the age vulnerabilities, the age critical vulnerabilities? Would you like to see that? Yes. Maybe they say no, but have the conversation. And then, of course, be careful too. And I'll add one more to the end, but on the be careful thing, I think people see it, or you see it all the time, right? Where we were flying out from DC, and I think the advertised flight time to Chicago was 2 hours. And once Nate and I boarded the plane, they said 1 hour and 23 minutes. So what are they doing there, right? They want to make sure that they're not delayed. They want to make that time. So yes, they were within the 2 hours, and therefore, you know, no penalties. Their customer rating is high. They got me and Nate where we needed to be within the allotted time. Everyone's happy, right? So metrics can drive behavior and unattended behavior that you don't necessarily want to see. Another quick example, a little more extreme, the mid-1990s, the UK privatized the rail system and levied heavy penalties on the companies that took over if they did not meet time objectives. So one of the things what happened, trains would not even show up to stops. or they would pick up passengers and not finish the complete trip. Because if you don't make a complete trip, right, you can't be late. So that impacted customer service and had all sorts of unintended consequences. So again, take time, understand what you're trying to get out of the metrics, what you're trying to achieve. Don't just rush to, hey, let's just go do these things. Be very, very careful. And then the last thing, sixth thing, would be try to automate this, because if you're using spreadsheets and doing it in any other way that's labor intensive, probably not worth your time, to be honest with you. And most of us have been around long enough to know that security metrics, that's not a new thing. What I think you're going to see, and I hope we see around cybersecurity performance improvement, now that we have more assets in the cloud, more API-enabled applications, we're able to get this information and do more with it quicker, right? So it doesn't necessarily involve dev teams, analysts with spreadsheets, lots of back and forth. You can really focus on what you need to do to improve security and drive improvement in your security program. Renee's going to come up here briefly and talk about the advantages of measuring your security program effectiveness.
Thanks, Jesse. If you embrace the idea of CPI, I think there are a few key things that really will improve security posture. For example, where do you focus in deep dive, right? As a leader of the security team, there are many options, right? There's vulnerability management, there's logging, there's asset inventory control, there's working with application teams and other consumers of the data, right? There's so many things you could deep dive into. And since some of the security investment is pretty new, right, there's potentially a lot of areas you could improve. And we've seen, of course, a dynamic environment. Lara mentioned it, right? Columbia mentioned it. With the cloud and these other applications, you don't always have control of the stakeholders, right? You don't always have control of development teams. And so it's not just the security team, right? It's the whole organization working together, and it's educating people about why security matters. And so, if you take an example of you've standardized application log data for your organization, that's great, right? And you've messaged that change. Well, what if new developers join the team and they build a new application and they're not aware of this new policy, right? And they start sending logs to your central logging system. That's great. They're not standardized, right? So if you continuously monitor and you have CPI, your own metric that says, well, how many applications are logging in compliance with our organizational policy, and you automatically generate a report or an alert to somebody that says, there's a new application and its logging format isn't standardized, you now have an opportunity to immediately improve that, right? You can reach out to somebody and try to figure out, okay, maybe they don't know about this policy, we can help them, we can show them how to do this, as opposed to, the logs are there, and a breach happens, somebody looks at the logs 6 months later, and they determine that, well, those logs haven't been compliant for 6 months with our logging policy, and therefore our automated alerts for behavioral analysis didn't work, and that's why we didn't see this breach, right? So that's, our opinion, a much worse situation. We think that's one of the main advantages of, it's not just setting something up once, it's really continual compliance with the goals and making sure you can measure what those goals are. I mentioned, the prioritization. Of course, say security investment, right? You have a limited budget. If you're only capturing logs from 5% of your systems, and someone's advocating, an enterprise security purchase, right? There's nothing wrong with enterprise security per se, but is that the best investment for your organization at that time to spend several $100,000 if you know that you only have 5% log coverage, and therefore the analytics you're going to get out of enterprise security are going to be on 5% of your assets, right? At least if you have the data, you can have a healthy conversation with, does this investment make sense? Or should we focus on collecting, broadening our logging scope, and then perhaps investing in a tool like that once we're ready to do it? So I think those healthy conversations, that transparency, we've seen is really helpful, because sometimes you can have people that mandate a tool or mandate a purchase, and they just assume potentially, oh, we must have 100% log coverage, or we must be doing this, so we're ready. Well, do we have enough FTEs to support an onboarding of a new integration like enterprise security? Are the application logs standardized to support this, and so on. Of course, the cost of the components, right, is of course people, licensing, infrastructure, especially true with the cloud, right? And some of the advanced tools, they can require quite a lot of infrastructure in Amazon or Azure to operate. And the reason we we don't have anything against the SIMs, right? There's a lot of great tools out there. We're just making the point, if it's kind of, you put garbage data in, what is the advanced analytics going to give you, right? If you only have visibility into a certain percentage of your assets or users, then you should just understand what that's probably going to mean on the output side, right? The old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And we made the point about TCO. I'll hand it off to Jesse.
All right. Thanks, Nate. So to drive this point home just a little bit more before we get into some of the specifics of what we're talking about. Equifax, we've all heard of Equifax. And I know I don't even have to ask a show of hands. I'm pretty sure most of you don't have an $85 million cybersecurity budget. Wish, right? So $85 million, 145 days, right? We all know this, right? And they still got it wrong with $85 million. They had all the things, right? What happened, right? It's funny, the 2016 Equifax annual report, I don't know how many people have read it, but in there they looked ahead to 2017 and they listed 5 corporate imperatives for 2017. Number 4 was to be a trusted advocate, right, for the consumers and customers. So I don't think jeopardizing, 145 million plus of their customers met that mission. And that just speaks to the fact that no visibility to what was going on at the upper echelons of Equifax. Board, C-level, did not know, but yet that was a business imperative. It was in the annual report. But yet, the ops team, right, the business owners, the boots on the ground, for some reason that data did not make its way up. And again, you look to the picture we had in the beginning with the gaps, right? And in the complete picture. I think that is very consistent with a lot of organizations where things just get lost in translation for whatever reason, right? Not blaming anyone, it's just the way it is. So how do you fix that, right? How do you have a defensible cybersecurity program? How do you take what you have and truly understand what your risk is? And that's a different conversation and a different topic, but risk, we like to think that we understand, third-party risk management, all these conversations about risk. If you're compliant, you have a tool, that's not a complete risk picture, right? How are you performing? Are you capturing all the things that you said you were going to do? Maybe you know that you're not, and that's good, because that gives you some information, and that informs your overall picture of what your true risk is. And then you can have those conversations and go, you know what? I don't know that I'm green anymore. Maybe I'm more orange or yellow, because I know that my team is doing their best, but we don't have 100% coverage. That's a different conversation than we have Splunk and we're compliant, right? That's just whitewashing the real situation. So how could this Equifax thing happen? Nate?
So we talk about, of course, cybersecurity is not just technology, right? It's technology, people, and process. And if you look at Equifax, right, they had a vulnerability scanning tool, so that was good. So that we say their people are kind of, it's a question mark, right? We don't have necessarily visibility into their conversations, but they could have been technically capable, but perhaps they didn't recognize the flawed process, right? They didn't recognize that this vulnerability that was outstanding for tens and then became, the 140 days was not patched, right? Maybe there was an operational concern of system administrators didn't want to patch it because they needed a certain maintenance window, right? I'm sure you've all heard stories like that, but someone wasn't thinking about, well, gee, what if this vulnerability is actually exploited because we've waited 100 and some days to patch it, right? And so we say that leads to the third part of the process, the vulnerability management process and the patching process. Presumably wasn't working in Equifax, right? And it's tough. I mean, we've worked in large environments, as you mentioned, the cloud, and lots of stakeholders, and it's tough. You might have the power technically to patch an application team systems, right? But if you break it, then you end up in all these escalations and situations, right? So their situation might be understandable, but conceptually we know that the patching is good, right? And patching quickly is good. But yet you have this organization with at least $85 million cybersecurity budget, and they weren't executing their patching and vulnerability management process correctly. And so we would say, look, if they had CPI metrics, they would have seen the potential problem, right? There was vulnerabilities, critical vulnerabilities or high vulnerabilities on public-facing systems. going on for over 100 days, and geez, the organizational SLA is 14 days, wow, there's a huge problem there, right? Someone then potentially would have dug into that and said, oh, what's going on here? There's 2 servers that haven't been patched, there's 20 servers, whatever. And evidently that didn't happen. And so we say, really, buying technology is the easy part, right? If someone says, oh, we're gonna get the budget, we're gonna buy this tool X, that's great. But then, right, what's the process behind it? And are the people ready to embrace that technology and process to actually put it into use, right, 24/7? Because standing it up and requiring professional services can be done fairly easily. You might ask, why are we talking about vulnerability management and SIM? We think they're good examples to illustrate the concept of CPI. They're kind of foundational tools that a lot of people are using in their cybersecurity programs. But I'm sure you can all think of, okay, what kind of metrics could you use for other security tools, right? They're virus scanning, right? You could say, well, I want virus scanning and software firewalls on my PCI systems, and maybe I have a separate policy for, maybe I'm not going to enforce installing antivirus on student laptops, et cetera, right? You could envision metrics and CPI to dictate how successful you are in those other tools. So we made the point about it, not just being a tool, and we think, this kind of brings up the issue that a lot of times what we've seen, right, security often sees the effect of something, right? It's often that there's broader policy, whether it's something that people didn't appreciate the reason, right? Maybe they didn't appreciate the reason for logging until security came along and said, well, it'd really be great if we had logs from all of these systems. But there's often have to work with other parts of the organization, right? And so if you're coming in as a security team and you're finding an issue, we say you kind of can uncover things, right? You might uncover data standardization issues when you implement a SIM. You might determine that you don't have a good asset database or CMDB, or you have maybe 50 asset databases and there might be issues in certain of those areas. You might have gaps in logging. You might think, okay, great, we have a SIM, we're going to generate automated alerts, and you might find that, well, is there some sort of location where I can get a call tree, right? Who owns this application? Who is the security contact for this application? And we've seen those types of things. Right? And you probably have too. And vulnerability management, I think you see similar things, right? Asset classification. How often should these things be scanned? Are they named appropriately? Are they tagged? How does that tie into the SLA, right? You might have a different SLA for things that are PCI and sensitive data versus a student's laptop. You might decide that you need to do credentialed patch audits on certain types of systems. So I think when you implement something like vulnerability management, you can bring out all of those issues. But it's also a great opportunity to then work with people and try to drive the change, because if you actually do that, you're going to improve security posture, ideally, right? If you went from a situation where you had a very poor quality asset database and you're able to move to a place where assets are tagged, applications are tagged, you have security owners, and now you have vulnerability results and you can automatically send those vulnerability results to the business owners of those applications, and you can track the metrics, you should be in a better place from a security perspective. And as a side note, right, auditing and the idea of compliance should become pretty easy if you're managing metrics at this level, right? If you can produce a report that says, here's our audit logging coverage, here's how we track vulnerability management. We have SLAs defined for each asset class. We automatically alert the people, if we find assets that aren't in our database because we've scanned something. It's much more defensible to pass an audit, right? It's not just assembling documentation and trying to get through it. You have the entire process built around being secure, and as a side note, you should be able to achieve compliance quite easily. And we've made this point before, just the dynamic nature of the cloud and other large decentralized environments. It shouldn't be just the goal of security, obviously shouldn't be a quarterly audit, right? It should be continuous health, right? What is our security posture today? And so managing the metrics actually enables you to do that, right? Because you can continuously monitor and build that into your processes, whether it's standing up infrastructure, standing up new applications, checking how many systems are logging to the SIM, right? All of those things can turn into continuous management and alerts to try to proactively deal with things. So moving to the next slide here, inventory and vulnerability management. So we've seen slides like this produced by our security teams, and if you look at the y-axis, it's going to represent the number of critical vulnerabilities,
On the x-axis, we have date. And this is Jesse's point earlier. Okay, so this tells you that this organization is looking at vulnerabilities. They have them broken down to critical. Okay, that's good. But to us, this raises a lot of questions, right? How many assets in this organization are being scanned? How many assets does this organization have? How old are these vulnerabilities, right? If these 12 vulnerabilities were detected yesterday and the organization's SLA is 7 days, well, they still have 6 days to patch them, right? If these vulnerabilities are 140 days old and they're on public-facing web servers, now you're kind of in the Equifax territory, right? So that could be much more concerning. How old is the oldest vulnerability? Are there vulnerabilities that are in this chart that have existed for 3 years? Right? Why haven't they been patched in 3 years? Right, so this kind of says, hey, the team's doing stuff, but it raises a lot of questions. If you take that to, well, a CPI, what does our concept really look like? We would say, here's an example of using the concept of CPI. It's taking that vulnerability data, right? So it's the same tool. It's using the vulnerability tool that the organization already had, but it's adding that higher level of metrics to it. It's saying, okay, let's calculate the assets here, number 1 here, the percent of discovered assets over the last 30 days not found in inventory, not tracked in inventory. So this is using data from the vulnerability scanner. You have a Palo Alto firewall pulling in that data as well, saying, well, this IP address connected to the firewall, so it was an asset at this point in time, but it's not in the inventory. Or this IP address was found by the vulnerability scanner, but it's not in inventory. So that's in a sense a gap, right? Because if that asset isn't tagged as PCI or sensitive data or student, you don't really necessarily know maybe, right, what type of SLA should be applied to it, if its vulnerability is really critical or not critical. And so that's an opportunity of a list of IP addresses. If you have tools like Gulp, you could then track that down and say, okay, well, who owns that device, right? Why isn't this in inventory? What is it? Number 2 here is looking at the average age of critical vulnerabilities. As of our most recent snapshot, what is our average age? And if you have a goal there, you can measure that and say, well, geez, actual we're 30, but the goal is 7. That's potentially concerning. I have number 4 here is the percent of assets scanned over 30 days. So if you have an organizational goal that I want to scan every asset at least every 30 days, how well are you doing at that? And then the bottom chart here is visualizing this average age of vulnerabilities over time. And essentially, I would hope if Equifax had a chart like this, they would have averted the breach, right? They would have said, look, hey, it's at 144, right? If our goal is maximum of 7 days allowed for critical vulnerabilities, oh, we're way over that, right? And the idea here is, well, add your tag data, group it by network, whatever types of tags and classifications make sense for your organization, and then you can also have different SLAs for highs, mediums, lows, right, depending on what that means to the organization. If we look at the concept of CPI in terms of a SIM, before, right, you could say, okay, you have a Splunk team or have a logarithm, and their team is producing a chart that says, well, this is how many alerts. We have alerts on this right y-axis, and on the left y-axis, we have the number of logs being captured a day. So look, we're doing lots of stuff, right? We're generating, several hundred alerts per day, and we're capturing over 1 million logs a day. Okay, well, to me, right, this raises the question, well, what does this actually mean, right? How many logs should you have per day? Do you have logs from all the assets, right? Which assets are you required to have logs from? Which applications are you missing data from, right? We see this trend in terms of the different number of alerts there, but how many applications does this organization have? Is the team capable of acting on 400 alerts per day, right? Or are they ignoring some of them, right? So one potential CPI calculation here, right, would be looking at logs by application. And if you look at it in this way, you can say, well, look, I mean, you know immediately, right, the y-axis is the number of applications here, and the orange is applications with logs. So you can see that there's a gap, that you essentially never have a day where you have logs from all applications. So if I was managing this logging team, I would want them to start focusing on why we don't have the logs, right? And can you work with the teams and figure out why they aren't sending us the logs? Are they not, indexed properly? They're not tagged properly? Because this message is much different, right? It says we don't consistently capture logs from all the applications. And then people can have an honest conversation about what that might mean and why it's important. So we suggest a few metrics here as a starting point to kind of illustrate this in a bit of detail. And we show that the metrics are of course, a lower level idea. The CPI, or the Cybersecurity Performance Indicator, in the first two here, you can see it's, if you take the, for example, number of assets with authentication and authorization logs as one metric, and you use your SIM to generate that value, and then you have the number of assets that require authentication and authorization logs, and then you can produce a CPI in terms of your percent coverage for that, right? And so this is your numerator, and that's your denominator. Now you have a CPI that you might want to show on a dashboard, or to leadership, and to the team that's responsible for reaching out to people, and you can track that. If you have Palo Alto, other types of firewalls that have NAT translation logs, and you want to track how many assets are coming through the firewall but might not be in my inventory system, might not be vulnerability scanned, you can say, okay, well, how many assets are producing these translation logs? How many assets am I capturing, right? Maybe you have 10 firewalls and you're only capturing NAT translation logs from 5 of them, right? Well, that's a gap because you don't know definitively, right, how many assets are coming through those other 5 firewalls. So that can become an organizational goal of, well, we need to work with the network engineering team to capture logs from these other firewalls. And from the continuous monitoring perspective, it's actually really great, right? Because maybe a network link broke one day, right? And maybe there's a management interface that's sending logs to the management interface, and something happened, right? Cable broke, and you're not capturing logs. If you have that on a dashboard, you can ask, wow, I noticed that we're not capturing logs from this one device. Did you turn it off? And oh, no, let's investigate, right? Oh, something happened, a cable broke, right? And that's why we don't have logs from that one device. You can potentially proactively fix that, as opposed to, well, it's been broken for 6 months and no one was monitoring that. We didn't have alerts on that. On the network engineering side, no one knew that the logs weren't reaching us. We just assumed, the routers were configured to send logs, so we must have the logs. Well, it's an assumption, right? But better to monitor it. So continuing, of course, you can read some of these, but looking at the SIM, right, is this a higher level thing? I'd probably want to know the percent coverage of applications with application level logs. And of course, there's operating system logs, and if you have something like a forwarder on them for Splunk, they're pretty easy to get. But application logs can come in all types of varieties, right, depending on who the manufacturer of the software was or the development team, the standardization goals for the organization. At least in our experience, right, application logs are harder to standardize than operating system logs. If you have Red Hat 7 organization, most of your Red Hat 7 logs are going to look pretty similar because people probably aren't changing the configuration of that log too much. But if you have 200 separate applications used, right, some are running .NET, some are Java, who knows, right, what the logs look like. Suggestions here when you need to separate logs, by indexes, right, how many logs and how many applications are separated or tied to LDAP groups. If you need to say that application 1 isn't allowed to see application 2's logs, if you need to monitor that, you can monitor that. What percentage of high priority alerts close within the organization's SLA, right? And this might lead to questions about, well, maybe we're generating too many alerts, right? Which alerts really matter? Or maybe all of these alerts are really valuable and we don't have enough people to close them, and that's why they're not closed in a reasonable amount of time. So that data might lead to justification for additional investment in a security team. We mentioned earlier, right, number of open alerts. You're generating hundreds of alerts, that's potentially great. Hopefully you're closing hundreds of alerts a day as well. And this grouping just shows how you can take, 2 metrics and create CPIs out of them.
Good. Thanks, Nate. We have about 5 minutes left. Okay, I'll leave some time for questions. But in summary, right, so most organizations, you've already made the decision to purchase a SIM, Splunk, a scanner of some sort. It's important. You probably didn't buy it knowing that, well, I'm only going to scan half of my assets, or I'm going to only monitor 20%. So what this really does, with very minimal effort, if it's automated, right, and there's tools to do this. That's the last bullet here. Come talk to Nate and I, we'll talk to you, we have some ideas. If you automate this, this is really really low touch, right? It's almost plug and play, not to oversimplify, but it really frees up your security team to work on securing your organization, right? Not chasing spreadsheets around or, just running around tracking things down. So take advantage of the tools that you bought, right? Don't buy anything else. They're very powerful tools. Increase your ROI from those tools. And I said, operationalize it. Right? You bought these things for a reason. 50% coverage probably wasn't why. Also, CPIs also help security teams demonstrate value. So again, it's back to the activity versus achievement thing. It makes great reports, right? So we're saying, well, we're doing 200, 300, 3,000 alerts a day. That's great. That sounds impressive. But if you could say, hey, we went from 50% coverage to 100% coverage, or we're moving in that direction, right? So it's really about cybersecurity maturity, process maturity, in an easy, that's kind of understated, but I don't want to make this sound too easy because it's not, because it would have already been done, but through automation, you can really take advantage of the promises of security metrics and all the things that we've been hearing about for the last 20 years. So again, look to automate. That's key, right? And then the security posture, and we talked a little bit about risk too by exposing the process deficiencies. And not to repeat myself too much, but this is very important. Don't be lulled into a sense of false security by thinking we've spent money, you have teams, you do these things, that gets reported up to the provost or CIO or whatever the leadership chain is. And they're surprised when we're hacked, right? It's not if, but when. So have those conversations, show progress, right? Show that the teams are doing something that's meaningful, and you're moving the ball forward. And automate. That's the key. All right, any questions for Nate or I? Thank you very much. None. We did that good of a job, huh? All right, well, thank you.